The crisp November morning when I found a bright orange citation stuck to my truck windshield should have been my first clue that things were about to get messy. But I honestly thought it was just some kind of mistake. I yanked the paper off the glass and squirmed at the bold letters declaring that I was in violation of some obscure vehicle storage ordinance and owed the Pinewood Meadows Homeowners Association $300. The problem was that I lived on Riverside Drive in Bozeman, Montana, and my property had never been part of any HOA, at least not according to the deed I signed when I bought the place 2 years ago. My name is Yusuf Young, and I work as a structural engineer for a firm in downtown Bozeman. I bought my house specifically because it sat on the edge of town, with no HOA nonsense to deal with. I had grown up in a neighborhood where the HOA president would measure the length of grass blades and fine people for having mailboxes painted the wrong shade of black. When I finally saved enough for my own place, freedom from petty bureaucracy was at the top of my priority list. The citation claimed I was storing commercial vehicles on residential property, which was laughable because the truck in question was my personal Chevy Silverado. Sure, it was a heavy-duty model, but I used it for camping, hauling firewood, and occasionally helping friends move furniture. There was nothing commercial about it. The fine also mentioned that storing vehicles on unpaved surfaces during winter months violated Section 12.7 of the Pinewood Meadows Covenants. I crumpled the paper in frustration and headed inside to make coffee. My property consisted of a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on 2 acres of land. The previous owner had installed a gravel driveway that extended from the main road back to a small clearing where I parked my truck during the snowy months. The truck sat on gravel, not grass, so I failed to see the issue even if I were part of their ridiculous HOA. I pulled up my property survey on my laptop while sipping coffee and confirmed what I already knew. My land was clearly outside the Pinewood Meadows subdivision boundaries by at least 200 feet. After breakfast, I called the number printed on the citation. A woman answered on the third ring with a tone that suggested I had already interrupted something important. Her name was Brenda Patterson, and she identified herself as the Pinewood Meadows HOA president. I explained that there must be some mistake because my property was not part of their association. "Excuse me, but I have the survey maps right here, and your property clearly falls within our extended jurisdiction," Brenda said sharply. "We expanded our boundaries last year to include properties along Riverside Drive for aesthetic continuity purposes." "That is not how property boundaries work," I replied, keeping my voice level. "You cannot just decide to expand your jurisdiction over private property that never agreed to be part of your HOA. I have my deed and survey right here." "Well, you clearly do not understand how community standards work, Mr. Young. Your property affects the viewshed of our residents and therefore you are subject to our covenants." I almost laughed. The viewshed. My nearest neighbor in your development is 300 yards away through a stand of pine trees. Nobody can even see my property from Pinewood Meadows. "That is irrelevant," Brenda snapped. "The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay or we will place a lien on your property." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what just happened. This woman genuinely believed she could enforce HOA rules on property that was not part of her association. I pulled up the Montana statutes on HOAs and confirmed that they could only enforce covenants on properties that had explicitly agreed to be bound by them through recorded documents. My deed contained no such restrictions. I decided to take the afternoon off work and drive to the county recorder's office in downtown Bozeman. The clerk, An older gentleman named Robert helped me pull up all the recorded documents related to my property. We went through everything carefully: the original subdivision plat, my deed, the title insurance policy, and every easement on record. Nothing, absolutely nothing, connected my property to Pinewood Meadows HOA. "This is interesting," Robert said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Let me pull up the Pinewood Meadows documents." He typed for a moment, then frowned. "According to what I am seeing here, they did file an amendment last year attempting to expand their boundaries, but it looks like they never got the required signatures from affected property owners. This amendment is invalid. So they just filed paperwork claiming to expand their territory without actually getting permission from the people whose property they wanted to include. Looks that way. This happens more often than you would think. Some HOAs get overzealous and think they can unilaterally expand. The law does not work that way, though. Every property owner would need to sign a consent form and have it recorded. I asked Robert for certified copies of my deed and survey, plus a letter stating that no valid HOA covenants affected my property. He printed everything out and stamped each page with the official county seal. Armed with this documentation, I felt confident that this whole mess would blow over once I showed Brenda the proof. 2 days later, I received a second citation, this time for $400. The new violation claimed I was operating an unpermitted outdoor storage facility because I had a small shed where I kept my lawnmower and tools. The shed had been there when I bought the property, and the county had no problem with it. I was starting to realize that Brenda was not going to be reasonable about this. I decided to attend the next Pinewood Meadows HOA meeting, which according to their website happened on the first Tuesday of every month. When I arrived at the community clubhouse, I was surprised by how nice the facility was. The subdivision clearly had money. Expensive cars filled the parking lot, and the landscaping looked professionally maintained. I walked into a conference room where about 30 residents sat in folding chairs facing a table where Brenda presided alongside 4 board members. Brenda was exactly what I expected. She appeared to be in her late 40s with short blonde hair styled in that particular way that seemed to require a daily blow-dry appointment. She wore a cream-colored blazer and had reading glasses on a chain around her neck. When I entered, she looked up from her papers and her expression immediately soured. "Can I help you?" she asked coldly. "This is a private meeting for Pinewood Meadows residents only. My name is Yusuf Young. I live on Riverside Drive, and you have been sending me citations claiming I am violating HOA rules. I am here to clarify that my property is not part of your association, and I would appreciate it if you stopped harassing me." The room went silent. Several residents turned in their chairs to look at me. Brenda stood up slowly, like a teacher about to discipline an unruly student. "Mr. Young, we have been over this. Your property falls within our extended boundaries, and you are required to comply with our covenants. If you continue to refuse, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action." I walked toward the front table and set down the stack of certified documents from the county recorder's office. "These are official county records proving that my property has never been part of your HOA and that your boundary expansion from last year was never properly executed. You do not have jurisdiction over my land." Brenda barely glanced at the documents. "Our attorney has assured us that our expansion was legitimate. Your refusal to cooperate is making this difficult for everyone. All we ask is that you maintain reasonable standards so that our property values are not negatively impacted. Your property values are not my concern. I own my land free and clear, and I will use it however I want within the bounds of county regulations. You have no authority over me." One of the board members, a thin man in his 50s, spoke up. "Maybe we should have our attorney review these documents before we proceed further." Brenda shot him a glare that could have frozen water. "We do not need to review anything, Harold. Our position is clear." "Actually, Brenda, if his property really is not part of the HOA, we could be opening ourselves up to liability by continuing to fine him," Harold said carefully. "Whose side are you on?" Brenda hissed. I decided to leave them to argue among themselves. "I have provided you with proof. If I receive any more citations, I will consider it harassment and I will take appropriate legal action. Have a good evening." As I walked out, I heard Brenda say something about entitled people who did not care about community standards. I drove home feeling like I had accomplished something, but also worried that this was far from over. Sure enough, a week later, I received a third citation. This one claimed I was operating a home business without approval because I occasionally worked from home. The fine was $500. I also found a notice taped to my door stating that if I did not pay the accumulated fines totaling $1,200 within 10 days, the HOA would file a lien against my property. That was when I decided to hire an attorney. I called a local real estate lawyer named Mitchell Rhodes who had good reviews online. When I explained the situation during our initial consultation, he actually laughed. "So let me get this straight," Mitchell said, leaning back in his office chair. "This HOA is trying to enforce covenants on your property even though you were never part of their association, and they filed an invalid boundary expansion without getting consent from affected property owners. That is exactly what is happening. This is slam dunk case, Yusuf. Not only are their fines completely unenforceable, but if they actually file a lien against your property, they will be violating Montana law. We could sue them for harassment, slander of title, and possibly even seek damages for emotional distress and attorney fees. I just want them to leave me alone. I understand, but sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Let me draft a cease and desist letter explaining the legal situation and warning them of the consequences if they continue." That usually scares HOAs into backing down once they realize they could be personally liable. Mitchell drafted a strongly worded letter that laid out all the legal reasons why the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. He included citations to Montana statutes and case law. He also warned that any further attempts to fine me or place a lien on my property would result in immediate legal action seeking damages. The letter cost me $300, but it seemed worth it to make this nightmare stop. I thought the legal letter would end things, but I had underestimated Brenda's stubbornness. 3 days after Mitchell sent the letter, I came home from work to find a towing company trying to hook up my truck. I ran outside and yelled at the driver to stop. "What do you think you are doing?" I shouted. The driver, a young guy in his 20s, looked confused. I got a call from a homeowners association saying this vehicle was abandoned and needed to be removed. "This is my truck on my property. It is not abandoned. Who authorized you to tow it?" He pulled out his phone and showed me a work order from Brenda Patterson listing my address and claiming the vehicle had been stored illegally for over 30 days. I took photos of the work order with my phone. This woman does not have authority over my property. This is theft. If you tow my truck, I will call the police and have you arrested. The driver unhooked the truck immediately. "Hey man, I do not want any trouble. I am just doing what the customer asked. If this is not legit, I am out of here." He left quickly and I immediately called Mitchell. "They just tried to tow my truck," I told him. "Are you serious? That is conversion, possibly theft. Did you get documentation?" I took photos of everything. Forward those to me right now. We are filing suit tomorrow. This has gone way beyond harassment. They are now attempting to deprive you of your property. That evening, I also called the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office to file a report about the attempted towing. A deputy came out to take my statement, and I showed him all the documentation proving my property was not part of the HOA. The deputy, whose name tag Reed Morrison, shook his head as he reviewed everything. This is a civil matter mostly, but the attempted towing could be considered criminal if we can prove intent to permanently deprive you of property. I will file a report and send it to the county attorney's office. In the meantime, I would suggest getting a restraining order if they keep harassing you. My attorney is filing a lawsuit tomorrow. Good. Document everything. If they step foot on your property again without permission, call us immediately and we can arrest them for trespassing. The next morning, Mitchell filed a lawsuit in Gallatin County District Court against Pinewood Meadows HOA and Brenda Patterson personally. The complaint alleged harassment, slander of title, attempted conversion, and violations of Montana's HOA statutes. We sought damages of $50,000 plus attorney fees. Mitchell also filed for a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from taking any further action against me or my property. The court granted the temporary restraining order that same day. A process server delivered copies of the lawsuit and restraining order to Brenda that evening. I wish I could have seen her face when she received them. For about a week, things were quiet. I actually started to relax, thinking maybe the lawsuit had scared some sense into Brenda. Then I discovered she had posted about me on the Pinewood Meadows Facebook group. The post claimed I was a problem neighbor who refused to maintain basic property standards and was negatively impacting everyone's home values. She included photos of my property taken from the road, showing my truck on the gravel pad and my tool shed. She described me as uncooperative and entitled. I took screenshots of everything and sent them to Mitchell. He immediately filed an amended complaint adding defamation to our claims. This was getting expensive, but Mitchell assured me that we would recover all my attorney fees when we won. The Facebook post had an unintended consequence that worked in my favor. Several Pinewood Meadows residents messaged me privately expressing sympathy. One woman named Susan Chambers told me that Brenda had made life miserable for many people in the subdivision. She said Brenda used the HOA as her personal fiefdom and regularly exceeded her authority. Susan mentioned that several residents had tried to vote Brenda off the board, but she had manipulated the voting process to stay in power. Another resident, Thomas Nguyen, told me that Brenda had attempted to fine him $3,000 for painting his front door navy blue instead of the approved shade of blue specified in the covenants. Thomas had to hire an attorney to fight the fine, and he eventually won, but it cost him nearly $5,000 in legal fees. He said Brenda held a grudge against him ever since. Armed with this information, I asked Mitchell if we could use evidence of Brenda's pattern of harassment against other residents in our lawsuit. He said it would be relevant to show that her actions against me were part of a broader pattern of abuse of authority. The lawsuit proceeded slowly, as lawsuits tend to do. We exchanged discovery requests, took depositions, and filed various motions. During Brenda's deposition, she was combative and refused to acknowledge that she had done anything wrong. She insisted that my property was part of the HOA and that she had every right to enforce the covenants. When Mitchell showed her the certified county records proving otherwise, she claimed they were falsified. Are you suggesting that the Gallatin County Recorder's Office falsified official documents? Mitchell asked. I am saying that we have our own survey showing that Mr. Young's property is within our boundaries, Brenda replied. Can you produce this survey? Our attorney has it. We have requested all documents in discovery. Your attorney has not provided any such survey. If it exists, you are required to produce it. Brenda glared at Mitchell but said nothing. It became clear during the deposition that no such survey existed. Brenda had simply assumed she could expand the HOA's boundaries by fiat and had never bothered to verify the legal requirements. While the lawsuit ground forward, life continued. Winter arrived in full force and Bozeman got hit with several major snowstorms. My truck sat on its gravel pad under a layer of snow, and I made sure to photograph it regularly to document that it was not abandoned or in violation of any legitimate regulations. One Saturday morning in January, I looked out my window and saw a woman standing at the edge of my property taking photos with a professional camera. I pulled on my boots and coat and went outside to confront her. "Can I help you?" I called out. She lowered the camera and smiled pleasantly. "Hi there. I am conducting a property assessment for the Pinewood Meadows HOA, just documenting the condition of properties in the area. You are on my land without permission. That is trespassing. Leave immediately or I am calling the police. I am on the county road easement, actually." I looked down at where she was standing. She was right, technically, but barely. "Even so, you are taking photos of my property without my consent for the purpose of HOA enforcement. I have a restraining order against the HOA preventing exactly this type of harassment. If you work for them, you are violating that order." Her pleasant smile vanished. "I am just doing my job. Your job is to violate a court order. Leave now." She packed up her camera and walked back toward the Pinewood Meadows subdivision. I called Mitchell immediately and sent him photos I had taken of the woman. He said we could file a motion to hold the HOA in contempt of court for violating the restraining order. Before we could file anything, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney, a woman named Patricia Doyle. The letter stated that the HOA was prepared to dismiss all fines and drop any claims against my property if I would agree to withdraw my lawsuit. It was essentially an offer to settle. I called Mitchell to discuss it. "They are trying to settle because they know they are going to lose," he explained. "The question is whether you want to accept. We could definitely win at trial and get a judgment for damages, but trials are uncertain and expensive. Will this prevent them from harassing me in the future? We would draft a settlement agreement that includes a permanent injunction preventing them from taking any action against your property. If they violated it, they would be in contempt of court. What about my attorney fees? I have spent thousands of dollars defending myself against their baseless claims. We will demand full reimbursement of attorney fees as part of any settlement. If they refuse, we go to trial." Mitchell drafted a response demanding $50,000 in damages, full reimbursement of attorney fees, a formal written apology from Brenda Patterson, and a permanent injunction. We sent it off and waited for their response. A week later, Patricia Doyle called Mitchell. They negotiated back and forth and eventually reached an agreement. The HOA would pay me $25,000 in damages, reimburse all my attorney fees, which totaled approximately $12,000, issue a written apology, and agree to a permanent injunction. The settlement would also require the HOA to send a notice to all Pinewood Meadows residents clarifying that my property was not part of the association and that any previous statements to the contrary were incorrect. I agreed to the settlement terms. It took another few weeks to finalize all the paperwork, but eventually everything was signed and filed with the court. I received a check for $37,000, which covered my damages, attorney fees, and the additional costs I had incurred dealing with this mess. The written apology from Brenda was short and clearly written by their attorney rather than her personally. It stated that the HOA had made an error in determining the boundaries of its jurisdiction and apologized for any inconvenience caused to me. It was not as satisfying as I had hoped, but it was something. I thought that would be the end of the story, but there was one more surprise waiting. About a month after the settlement was finalized, I received a phone call from Susan Chambers, the Pinewood Meadows resident who had messaged me about Brenda's pattern of harassment. "Yusuf, I thought you should know that we finally managed to vote Brenda off the HOA board," Susan said excitedly. "After your lawsuit became public knowledge, a lot of residents started speaking up about how she had harassed them too. We got enough signatures to call a special election, and we voted her out. She is no longer HOA president." "That is fantastic news. Who replaced her?" "Harold Mitchell, the board member who questioned Brenda during that meeting you attended. He is a retired attorney and actually understands how HOAs are supposed to work. He has already started making changes to prevent the kind of abuse of power that Brenda engaged in. I am glad something good came out of this mess. There is more. Several residents who Brenda had fined over the years are now seeking refunds based on the precedent from your case. It turns out she exceeded her authority in a lot of situations. The HOA might have to pay out significant money to settle all these claims. What about Brenda herself? How is she taking all this? Not well. She actually put her house up for sale, and I heard she is moving out of state. I guess she cannot stand the embarrassment of being voted out and exposed for what she did." After I hung up with Susan, I sat on my porch and looked out at my property. My truck still sat on the gravel pad, covered in a fresh layer of snow. My tool shed stood in the corner of the yard, exactly where it had always been. Everything was exactly the same as it had been before this whole ordeal started, except now I had legal protection ensuring that no HOA could ever harass me again. The whole experience had taught me several important lessons. First, always verify your property boundaries and know exactly what restrictions, if any, apply to your land. Second, do not assume that HOAs or other organizations will act reasonably or within the bounds of the law. Some people, like Brenda, become intoxicated by even a small amount of power and will abuse it without hesitation. Third, document everything and do not be afraid to stand up for your rights, even when it means hiring an attorney and going to court. A few weeks after my conversation with Susan, I was surprised to receive a call from Harold Mitchell, the new Pinewood Meadows HOA president. He introduced himself and apologized profusely for everything that had happened. "I want you to know that the board deeply regrets how you were treated," Harold said. "We have implemented new procedures to prevent anything like this from happening again. We are also conducting a full audit of all fines and actions taken over the past 3 years to identify any other situations where Brenda may have exceeded her authority." "I appreciate you calling, Harold. I hope the new board leadership works out well for your residents." "Actually, I am calling for another reason too. We are having a community meet and greet next month, and I was hoping you might attend as our guest. I think it would be good for our residents to meet you and understand that you are just a normal person trying to live your life, not the villain that Brenda made you out to be. I was touched by the invitation. I will think about it. I have to admit, I am not eager to spend time with people who were reading Brenda's Facebook posts about me. I understand completely, but I think you would be surprised how many people never believed her nonsense. Most of us could see through her manipulations. It was just hard to organize opposition while she controlled the board meetings and communications. I told Harold I would let him know about the meet and greet. After we hung up, I discussed it with a few friends. They were divided. My friend Jake thought I should go and rub my legal victory in everyone's faces. My friend Amanda thought I should decline and just enjoy my peace and quiet. In the end, I decided to attend. Not to gloat, but to show that I held no ill will toward the residents who had nothing to do with Brenda's harassment. The community meet and greet was held on a Saturday afternoon in March. The weather had started to warm up, and much of the snow had melted. I drove over to the Pinewood Meadows clubhouse and was greeted at the door by Harold and several other board members. They were welcoming and genuinely apologetic about what had happened. Inside, about 50 residents mingled, eating snacks and chatting. When I entered, several conversations stopped as people turned to look at me. I felt self-conscious for a moment, but then Susan Chambers rushed over and gave me a hug. "I am so glad you came," she said warmly. "Come meet some people." She introduced me to various residents, and to my surprise, most of them were friendly and sympathetic. Many told me their own stories of being harassed or fined by Brenda for trivial violations. One man, Robert Chen, had been fined for parking his work van in his driveway overnight. Another woman, Linda Torres, had been threatened with fines because her fence was 6 inches taller than the maximum height specified in the covenants, even though she had received written approval before installing it. Brenda was a nightmare, Linda said, shaking her head. She acted like she owned the whole neighborhood. I am just glad someone finally stood up to her and won. The gathering turned into an impromptu therapy session where residents shared their Brenda horror stories. It was actually cathartic to hear that I was not the only one who had dealt with her unreasonable behavior. By the end of the afternoon, I felt much better about the whole situation. As I was leaving, Harold pulled me aside. "I want to thank you again for coming. I think this was healing for a lot of people. We have been living under Brenda's thumb for so long that many of us forgot what a normal, functional HOA is supposed to look like." "What does a functional HOA look like?" I asked with a smile. "One that focuses on maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable rules that actually matter, and treating residents with respect. Basically, the opposite of what Brenda was doing." I drove home feeling oddly satisfied. My ordeal had not only protected my own property rights, but had apparently sparked a positive change in the Pinewood Meadows community. Sometimes standing up to bullies has ripple effects you do not anticipate. Spring arrived, and I started spending more time outdoors working on my property. I built a new raised garden bed for vegetables and repaired some damaged fencing along the back of my land. Every time I worked outside, I felt a sense of freedom knowing that no one could fine me or threaten me for how I chose to use my property. One Saturday in April, I was outside splitting firewood when a car pulled up my driveway. I tensed for a moment, worried it might be some new HOA drama, but relaxed when I saw it was Thomas Nguyen, the Pinewood Meadows resident who had been fined over his door color. "Hey Yusuf," Thomas called out as he got out of his car. "I hope you do not mind me dropping by. Susan gave me your address. I wanted to talk to you about something." "Sure, what's up?" "I am organizing a group of residents who were wrongfully fined by Brenda. We are considering filing a class action lawsuit against her personally for the damages she caused. Would you be willing to meet with our attorney and discuss your case? Your successful lawsuit set a great precedent." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to just move on and put the whole thing behind me, but another part of me recognized that Brenda needed to be held accountable for the damage she had caused to multiple people. "Yeah, I will meet with your attorney." But I have to say, even if you win a judgment against Brenda personally, collecting might be difficult if she has moved out of state. We know, but it is about the principle. She needs to face consequences for what she did. Plus, our attorney thinks there might be grounds to sue the HOA itself for failing to properly supervise Brenda and allowing her to abuse her authority for so long. Keep me posted on how it develops. Thomas thanked me and left. I went back to splitting firewood, thinking about how one woman's power trip had created so much chaos and legal trouble for so many people. A few weeks later, I attended a meeting with Thomas's attorney, a sharp woman named Rachel Freeman who specialized in HOA disputes. About 15 Pinewood Meadows residents attended, each with their own story of being harassed or wrongfully fined by Brenda. Rachel took notes on everyone's experiences and asked detailed questions about the nature of each violation and how much money everyone had lost dealing with Brenda's actions. Based on what I am hearing, there are clear grounds for multiple claims against both Brenda Patterson personally and the Pinewood Meadows HOA, Rachel explained. The HOA has potential liability because its board members allowed Brenda to act without proper oversight. They should have been checking her actions against the actual covenants and state law. Their failure to do so enabled her abuse. What kind of damages are we looking at? Thomas asked. Between all of you, I would estimate at least $200,000 in actual damages for wrongful fines, attorney fees, and other costs. We could also seek punitive damages against Brenda personally if we can show that her actions were malicious or in reckless disregard of your rights. The group decided to move forward with the class action lawsuit. I agreed to be a supporting witness, though my individual case had already been settled. Rachel thought my successful lawsuit would help establish the pattern of wrongful conduct. The class action complaint was filed in May. It named both Brenda Patterson and the Pinewood Meadows HOA as defendants. The complaint alleged negligent supervision, breach of fiduciary duty, harassment, and violations of Montana HOA statutes. News of the lawsuit spread quickly through the community and even got picked up by the local newspaper, the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. I was interviewed by a reporter named Jennifer Walsh for an article about HOA abuse. I shared my story and explained how important it was for homeowners to understand their rights and not be intimidated by HOAs that overreach their authority. The article ran on the front page of the local section with the headline, "Local HOA President Faces Multiple Lawsuits Over Alleged Abuse of Power." The publicity seemed to make a difference. After the article ran, several more Pinewood Meadows residents contacted Rachel to join the class action. The total number of plaintiffs grew to 23 people. The potential damages increased accordingly. Meanwhile, I had my own surprise coming. In June, I received a letter from the Montana Attorney General's office. They had read about the lawsuits and were launching an investigation into HOA practices in the state. They wanted to interview me as part of their investigation. I met with an investigator named David Sanders at a coffee shop in downtown Bozeman. He asked me to walk through everything that had happened with Brenda and the Pinewood Meadows HOA. I provided copies of all my documentation, including the fraudulent fines, the attempted towing incident, and the court records from my lawsuit. "This is extremely helpful," David said, reviewing the documents. "We have received multiple complaints about HOA overreach across Montana. Your case is one of the clearest examples of an HOA exceeding its legal authority. We are considering proposing new legislation to strengthen homeowner protections and increase penalties for HOAs that violate the law." That would be amazing. No one should have to go through what I went through. The problem is that many homeowners do not have the resources to fight back like you did. They pay the wrongful fines because they cannot afford an attorney, or they are intimidated by the HOA's threats. We want to create mechanisms for the state to intervene in these situations. I left the meeting feeling like maybe some real change could come from this whole mess. If new laws were passed to protect homeowners from abusive HOAs, then at least my experience would have served a greater purpose. Summer passed quietly. I enjoyed my property without any HOA interference. I hosted barbecues, went camping in my truck, and generally lived my life the way I wanted. It was a stark contrast to the stress and anxiety I had felt during the height of the HOA conflict. In August, the class action lawsuit against Brenda and Pinewood Meadows HOA reached a settlement. The terms were confidential, but Thomas told me privately that the HOA's insurance company had agreed to pay out $400,000 to settle all claims. Brenda had contributed $50,000 from her own pocket as part of the settlement. Each plaintiff received between $10,000 and $30,000 depending on the severity of their damages. More importantly, the settlement required major reforms to how Pinewood Meadows HOA operated. The board had to implement new checks and balances to prevent any single person from having too much power. All fine decisions had to be approved by a majority of the board, not just the president. The HOA also had to hire an independent property management company to handle enforcement and ensure that all actions were consistent with the law. Harold called me after the settlement was finalized. "I just wanted to thank you again. Your willingness to fight back against Brenda really opened the floodgates. I do not think all these other residents would have come forward if you had not shown that it was possible to win. I am just glad it worked out for everyone. How is the HOA functioning now with all the reforms?" "So much better. It is actually pleasant to serve on the board now. We focus on things that actually matter, like maintaining the common areas and planning community events, instead of trying to micromanage everyone's lives. That is how it should be." In September, I received another call from the Attorney General's office. David Sanders informed me that they were proposing a new HOA reform bill for the Montana legislature to consider in the next session. The bill would create an HOA ombudsman position to help homeowners resolve disputes, strengthen disclosure requirements so buyers know exactly what they are getting into, and increase penalties for HOAs that violate homeowner rights. "We would like to invite you to testify before the legislature when the bill is introduced," David said. "Your story would be powerful in illustrating why these reforms are necessary." I agreed to testify. In January of the following year, I traveled to Helena, the state capital, to appear before the Montana House Judiciary Committee. I was nervous about speaking in such a formal setting, but I knew it was important. When my turn came, I sat at a table facing the committee members and told them my story. I explained how Brenda had tried to enforce HOA rules on my property, even though I was never part of the association, how she had attempted to have my truck towed, and how I had been forced to spend thousands of dollars on attorney fees to defend my basic property rights. The worst part was not just the money or the stress, I told the committee. It was the feeling of helplessness, of being targeted by someone who had a little bit of power and decided to abuse it. I was lucky because I had the resources to fight back. But how many homeowners do not? How many people just pay the wrongful fines because they cannot afford an attorney or they are afraid of what the HOA might do to them? Several committee members asked me questions about my experience and the legal process I had gone through. I answered as thoroughly as I could. When I finished testifying, the committee chair thanked me and said my testimony had been very persuasive. The HOA reform bill passed the Montana House and Senate with strong bipartisan support. The governor signed it into law in March. I was invited to attend the signing ceremony, and I got to shake the governor's hand and thank him for taking homeowner protection seriously. Standing there in the governor's office, watching him sign the bill that would help protect thousands of Montana homeowners from HOA abuse, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had started as a frustrating personal battle against an unreasonable HOA president had turned into something much larger. Real change had happened because I had refused to back down when I was in the right. After the signing ceremony, I drove back to Bozeman and went straight home. My truck was parked in its usual spot on the gravel pad. The tool shed stood in the corner of the yard. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago when this whole thing started, but everything felt different. I had fought for my rights and won. I had helped other people fight for their rights and win. And I had contributed to changing the law to protect future homeowners from the kind of harassment I had endured. I sat on my porch and looked out at my property that no HOA could ever touch, and smiled. It had been a long, stressful, expensive battle, but it had been worth it. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they hide behind the authority of a homeowners association. Sometimes you have to fight for what is right, even when it would be easier to just pay the fine and move on. And sometimes, when you stand up for yourself, you end up helping a lot of other people too. A few months later, I received an unexpected package in the mail. It was from Susan Chambers. Inside was a framed photo of Pinewood Meadows with a plaque that read, "Thank you for helping us take back our community." There was also a handwritten note from Susan explaining that all the residents who had been part of the class action lawsuit had chipped in to get me this gift as a token of their appreciation. I was touched by the gesture. I hung the photo in my home office, not because I wanted to remember the conflict, but because I wanted to remember that standing up for what is right can make a real difference in people's lives. The photo served as a reminder that communities function best when people stand up to those who abuse power, when neighbors support each other, and when we all insist on being treated with fairness and respect. Life returned to normal after that. I continued working as a structural engineer. I enjoyed my property without any HOA interference, and I occasionally met up with Thomas, Susan, and some of the other former plaintiffs for dinner or drinks. We had bonded through our shared experience of dealing with Brenda's harassment, and that shared experience had turned into genuine friendships. I never heard from Brenda Patterson again after she moved out of state. I occasionally wondered if she had learned anything from the lawsuits and the public embarrassment, or if she had simply found a new community somewhere else where she could exercise her need for control. I hoped for the sake of her new neighbors that she had changed, but I suspected she probably had not. People like Brenda rarely see themselves as the problem. One afternoon, about a year after the HOA reform bill became law, I was working in my garden when Harold Mitchell stopped by. We had stayed in touch occasionally, and he would sometimes update me on how things were going in Pinewood Meadows. "The community is doing great," Harold told me as we sat on my porch drinking iced tea. "We just finished some major upgrades to the common areas, and we did it all without any drama or conflict. It is amazing what you can accomplish when the HOA board focuses on actual community improvement instead of nitpicking everyone's personal choices." That is good to hear. Do you ever hear anything about Brenda? I heard through the grapevine that she tried to join the HOA board in her new community in Arizona. Apparently, someone there Googled her name and found all the articles about the lawsuits. They rejected her application to be on the board. She is pretty much radioactive in HOA circles now. I felt a small sense of satisfaction hearing that. Actions have consequences, and Brenda was living with the consequences of her behavior. That seemed fair. As Harold and I talked, I reflected on everything that had happened since that November morning when I found the first citation on my truck. I had gone from being a person who just wanted to live quietly on my property to becoming a reluctant advocate for homeowner rights. I had learned more about property law, HOA regulations, and the legal system than I ever wanted to know. But I had also learned something important about myself. I had learned that I could stand up to bullies, that I could fight for what was right even when it was difficult and expensive, and that sometimes one person refusing to back down can create ripples that help a lot of other people. My property on Riverside Drive remained exactly what I had always wanted it to be, a place where I could live free from petty bureaucratic interference, where I could park my truck wherever I wanted, where I could store my tools in a shed without getting fined, and where I could work from home without anyone questioning whether I was operating a business. It was my land, bought and paid for, outside the boundaries of any HOA. And now, thanks to the legal precedents set by my case and the new state laws that had been passed, other Montana homeowners had stronger protections too. I still see articles occasionally about HOA disputes in other parts of the country. Every time I read about someone being fined for ridiculous violations or threatened with liens for trivial infractions, I think about sharing my story with them. Sometimes I do reach out, offering advice and encouragement based on what I learned. I have helped several people understand their rights and connect with attorneys who can help them fight back against overreaching HOAs. The experience changed me in ways I did not expect. I used to be the kind of person who avoided conflict and tried to keep my head down. Now I am more willing to speak up when I see injustice. I am more confident in asserting my rights. And I am more aware of how important it is to document everything and know your legal position before entering any dispute. My friends sometimes joke that I have become the local HOA expert, and I suppose in a way I have. I have certainly learned more about HOA law than most people ever want to know. But that knowledge has been useful, both in protecting my own rights and in helping others protect theirs. As I sit here now, looking out at my property on a beautiful summer evening, I feel grateful for how everything turned out. Yes, it was stressful. Yes, it was expensive, although I ultimately recovered my costs and then some. And yes, it would have been easier to just pay the fines and hope Brenda left me alone. But I am glad I fought back. I am glad I stood up for my rights. And I am glad that my willingness to fight resulted in positive changes that will protect other homeowners for years to come. The whole experience taught me that institutions like HOAs only have the power that we give them. When they exceed their legal authority and people push back, their power evaporates. Brenda thought she could bully me into compliance because that is what had worked for her in the past. She did not expect me to verify my property boundaries, hire an attorney, and fight back through the legal system. She underestimated me, and that was her downfall. I hope my story serves as encouragement to anyone else dealing with an overreaching HOA or any other institution that is trying to exceed its authority. Document everything, know your rights, do not be afraid to hire an attorney if you need to, and do not back down when you know you are in the right. The legal system is not perfect, but it does provide mechanisms for people to protect their rights when they are willing to use them. My property is still outside the boundaries of Pinewood Meadows HOA, just as it always was. My truck still sits on the gravel pad during winter months. My tool shed still stands in the corner of my yard. Everything is exactly as it should be, and no one can fine me or threaten me for living my life on my own property. That freedom, that security in knowing my rights are protected, was worth every dollar I spent and every hour of stress I endured fighting Brenda and her fraudulent claims. And every time I pull into my driveway and see my house, my land, my truck, and my shed, I smile knowing that I won. Not just in court, but in the bigger battle to protect homeowner rights and prevent HOA abuse. That victory, that knowledge that I made a difference not just for myself, but for countless other homeowners, makes the whole experience worthwhile.